Pope Leo XIV has unleashed a silent revolution inside the Vatican. 10 radical changes in less than a month that are shaking the Catholic Church to its core. From barefoot bishops to opening secret Vatican gardens for the homeless, these aren't just symbolic gestures, they're seismic shifts in power, compassion, and the very soul of the Church. Insiders are stunned, critics are nervous, and the faithful are watching history being rewritten before their eyes. If you think the Vatican never changes, what you're about to see will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Church. Stay until the end, because the final reform could change your view of faith forever. If these changes shocked you, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Which reform do you think will impact the Church most? Join the conversation now. Part 1. Immediate restoration of Vatican employee bonuses. The first shockwave from Pope Leo XIV's papacy came within days of his election, a move that made headlines not just within the Catholic world, but across global media. In a bold reversal of his predecessor's policy, Pope Leo XIV announced the immediate reinstatement of the traditional conclave bonus for Vatican employees. This $500, approximately $550 bonus, distributed to nearly 5,000 staff members, had been suspended for over a decade under Pope Francis, who had redirected such funds to charity and social causes. For many Vatican workers, this announcement was more than just a financial windfall. It was a powerful signal that the new Pope intended to value and recognize the dedication of those who keep the Church's daily operations running, often behind the scenes and without fanfare. The corridors of the Vatican buzzed with excitement and gratitude as employees, from administrative staff to maintenance crews, received the unexpected news. But the move was about more than money. By restoring the bonus, Pope Leo XIV sent a clear message: he is committed to boosting morale and fostering a sense of community among the Vatican's workforce. In his public statement, the Pope emphasized that while charity remains a core value of the Church, so too does justice for those who serve it faithfully. He explained that the bonus was not just a reward, but a gesture of solidarity, a way to acknowledge the sacrifices and hard work of every Vatican employee, especially during times of transition and uncertainty. The reaction was immediate. International media outlets covered the story, with some praising the Pope's attention to internal church matters, and others questioning whether this signaled a shift away from the austere policies of the previous era. Within the Vatican, the mood was overwhelmingly positive. Many employees expressed renewed pride in their work and hope for a more inclusive and supportive environment under the new papacy. This first reform set the tone for what would become a month of rapid and dramatic change. By prioritizing the well-being of his staff, Pope Leo XIV made it clear that his leadership would be both compassionate and pragmatic, rooted in tradition, but unafraid to make bold decisions for the good of the Church community. Part 2. Opening Vatican gardens to the homeless. Just as the world was still reacting to the restoration of employee bonuses, Pope Leo XIV stunned observers again with another unprecedented act of compassion. In a move that broke with centuries of Vatican exclusivity, the Pope ordered that select private Vatican gardens and courtyards be opened regularly to provide shelter, food, and spiritual care for the homeless of Rome. For generations, the lush, meticulously maintained gardens behind the Vatican walls had been a symbol of papal privacy and privileged places where only the highest-ranking clergy and special guests could enter. But Pope Leo XIV saw an opportunity to transform these hidden sanctuaries into spaces of welcome and mercy. He declared that the beauty of the Church should not be reserved for the few, but shared with those most in need. The initiative was launched within the first month of his papacy. On designated days, Vatican staff and volunteers set up tents, distribute hot meals, and offer medical and counseling services among the ancient trees and fountains. The Pope himself made a surprise visit during the first event, greeting guests, listening to their stories, and praying with them in the open air. The impact was immediate and profound. Local charities and homeless advocates praised the Vatican's new openness, noting that the gesture was both practical and deeply symbolic. For many of Rome's homeless, stepping into the Vatican gardens was an experience of dignity and hope, an affirmation that they too are valued members of the human family. International media highlighted the story as a powerful example of faith in action. Some commentators called it a revolution of mercy, while others saw it as a challenge to other religious and civic institutions to rethink how they use their own resources. Inside the Vatican, the move sparked conversations about how the Church can better embody its mission of serving the least among us. By opening the Vatican gardens to the homeless, Pope Leo XIV demonstrated that true leadership is measured not by what is kept behind closed doors, but by what is shared with the world. This reform not only changed physical spaces, but also began to reshape the very spirit of the Vatican, making it more accessible, compassionate, and true to the Gospel's call to love and serve the poor. Part 3: Barefoot Bishops for Solidarity. The world had barely caught its breath from the first two reforms when Pope Leo XIV delivered another stunning message, one that would be seen, felt, and remembered not just within the Vatican, but around the globe. In an act that was both deeply symbolic and visually unforgettable, the Pope announced that he, along with the bishops attending a major public liturgy, would go barefoot as a sign of solidarity with the poor and marginalized. The announcement. The news broke just days before the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, a saint revered for his radical embrace of poverty and humility. In a special address, Pope Leo XIV explained the reasoning behind this bold gesture. We must never forget the dust on our feet, nor the suffering of those who walk this earth with nothing. Today we remove our shoes not to draw attention to ourselves, but to stand with those for whom shoes are a luxury. In their pain we find our calling. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Catholic world and beyond. For centuries, papal liturgies had been known for their grandeur, the gleaming vestments, the golden mitres, the polished marble floors. Shoes in particular were a subtle but powerful symbol of authority and dignity. For the Pope and bishops to appear barefoot was in many ways to strip away the trappings of power and stand exposed, vulnerable and equal before God and humanity. The day of the liturgy. On the day of the liturgy, St. Peter's Square was filled to capacity. Pilgrims and tourists, clergy and laypeople, journalists and skeptics all gathered eager to witness history. As the procession began, a murmur swept through the crowd. The Pope, in his simple white cassock, walked barefoot across the ancient stones. Behind him, cardinals and bishops, some hesitant, some visibly moved, followed suit, their bare feet a stark contrast to the usual pageantry. The impact was immediate and electric. Cameras zoomed in on the bare, weathered feet of men who, for much of their lives, had been shielded from the hardships of the world. Social media exploded with images and commentary. Some praised the Pope's humility, calling it a return to the roots of Christianity. Others questioned whether the gesture was merely symbolic or if it would lead to real change. The meaning behind the gesture. For Pope Leo XIV, the act was about more than symbolism. In his homily delivered barefoot from the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, he spoke passionately about the need for the Church to walk with the poor, not above them. He reminded the faithful that Jesus himself washed the feet of his disciples, and that the earliest Christians were known for their radical acts of service and solidarity. Too often, he said, we have allowed our titles and our comforts to separate us from those we are called to serve. Today we remember that our true authority comes not from what we wear, but from how we love. The Pope's words resonated deeply, especially among those who have long felt alienated from the Church's hierarchy. Many saw the barefoot liturgy as a powerful statement against clericalism and a call for greater humility among Church leaders. Catholic charities and organizations working with the poor reported a surge in support and interest as people were inspired to take concrete action in their own communities. Global reaction. The world's media covered the event extensively. Headlines ranged from Pope walks barefoot for the poor to Vatican ceremony breaks with centuries of tradition. Editorials debated the significance of the gesture, with some arguing that it was a necessary wake-up call for a Church often perceived as distant and aloof. Others wondered whether such acts could truly address the systemic issues facing the poor. Leaders from other faith traditions also took notice. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople sent a message of support recalling similar practices in Eastern Christianity. Leaders of other religions praised the Pope's willingness to embrace vulnerability and humility. Inside the Vatican. Within the Vatican, the barefoot liturgy sparked both admiration and debate. Some traditionalists worried that such public displays might undermine the dignity of the papal office. Others, especially younger clergy and lay staff, saw it as a breath of fresh air, a sign that the Church was willing to challenge itself and adapt to the needs of the times. In the days following the liturgy, Vatican officials reported a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Conversations about humility service and solidarity became more common, not just in sermons, but in everyday interactions. The Pope's example encouraged many to reflect on their own lives and the ways in which they could better serve others. The voices of the poor. Perhaps the most important reactions came from those whom the gesture was meant to honor. In shelters and soup kitchens across Rome, people living on the margins watched the liturgy on television or heard about it from volunteers. Many expressed surprise and gratitude that the Pope would choose to identify so publicly with their struggles. One man interviewed outside a shelter said, "For once it feels like the Church sees us not just as people to help, but as brothers and sisters. It gives me hope." Beyond symbolism, lasting impact. Skeptics questioned whether going barefoot for a day could really make a difference, but Pope Leo XIV made it clear that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, he announced new initiatives to increase church support for the homeless, the unemployed, and refugees. Dioceses around the world were encouraged to organize similar acts of solidarity, not just as annual events, but as ongoing commitments. The barefoot liturgy became a symbol of a broader movement, a church that is willing to step outside its comfort zone, to walk alongside the poor, and to challenge the status quo. It inspired conversations about how the Church could use its resources, influence, and moral authority to address the root causes of poverty and exclusion. A new chapter for the Church. For many, the image of Pope Leo XIV and his bishops walking barefoot across St. Peter's Square marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Church's history. It was a reminder that true leadership is not about power or prestige, but about service, humility, and solidarity with those who suffer. As one Vatican commentator put it, in a single gesture, the Pope reminded us all that the Church is at its best when it walks with the poor, not above them. The world watched, and many were moved. But for Pope Leo XIV, the barefoot liturgy was not an end, but a beginning, a call to action for the entire Church, to follow in the footsteps of Christ with humility and love. Part 4. Financial Transparency, Blitz. As the world continued to process the visual and spiritual impact of the barefoot bishops, Pope Leo XIV was already preparing his next move, a reform that would send shockwaves not just through church corridors, but also through financial centers and watchdog groups worldwide. In a bold and unprecedented step, the Pope launched what quickly became known as the Financial Transparency Blitz, setting a new standard for openness and accountability in Vatican finances. The announcement. Barely 3 weeks into his papacy, Pope Leo XIV called a press conference attended by both Vatican insiders and international media. Standing at the podium, he declared, "The Church must be a model of honesty and stewardship. Our resources are not ours alone, they belong to the people of God. We must account for every coin with integrity and humility." He then unveiled a sweeping plan. For the first time in history, the Vatican would publish detailed, independently audited financial records for all major departments and institutions. These reports would be available online, accessible to anyone in the world. The Pope also announced the formation of an independent financial oversight committee composed of lay experts from around the globe, economists, auditors, and anti-corruption specialists tasked with reviewing Vatican finances and recommending further reforms. Why this was revolutionary. For centuries, the finances of the Vatican had been shrouded in secrecy. While there had been occasional attempts at reform, the complex web of accounts, properties, investments, and donations often remained opaque, even to those within the Church. Whispers of mismanagement, waste, and even corruption had dogged the Vatican for decades, fueling suspicion among the faithful and providing ammunition for critics. Pope Francis had made important strides toward greater transparency, but many felt progress was too slow and too limited. With one sweeping gesture, Pope Leo XIV signaled that the era of closed books and hidden deals was over. The first release, within days of the announcement, the Vatican published its first comprehensive financial report on a new user-friendly website. The report detailed income and expenditures for the previous fiscal year, including sources of revenue, donations, investments, real estate, and major areas of spending, charity administration, maintenance, salaries, and more. For the first time, ordinary Catholics could see exactly how their donations were being used. The report also included a frank assessment of past mistakes and areas needing improvement. The Pope insisted that transparency meant not only showing successes but also acknowledging failures. "We cannot ask for trust," he wrote in a preface to the report, "unless we are willing to tell the whole truth." The Oversight Committee. The newly formed Oversight Committee was another historic innovation. Unlike previous Vatican bodies, this one included lay men and women from outside Italy and outside the clergy. The committee's mandate was clear conduct, independent audits, investigate any irregularities, and report directly to the Pope and the public. The Pope gave the committee full authority to request documents, question officials, and recommend disciplinary action if necessary. This move was met with both applause and anxiety. Reformers and transparency advocates hailed it as a breakthrough. Some longtime Vatican officials, however, worried about the loss of control and the potential for public embarrassment. But Pope Leo XIV was resolute. "Sunlight is the best disinfectant," he said. "If we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear." Global reactions. The reaction outside the Vatican was immediate and intense. Financial journalists and anti-corruption organizations praised the Pope's courage and called on other religious and non-profit institutions to follow suit. Major newspapers ran headlines such as "Vatican opens its books" and "Pope Leo XIV sets new bar for church transparency." Editorials noted that the move would likely inspire greater trust among donors and the faithful. Catholic commentators, meanwhile, debated what the new transparency would mean for the future of the Church. Some worried that revelations of past mismanagement might damage the Church's reputation. Others argued that honesty, even about mistakes, was essential for healing and renewal. Inside the Vatican, within the Vatican, the mood was mixed. Many employees and clergy welcomed the change, seeing it as an opportunity to correct old wrongs and build a healthier culture. Others, especially those accustomed to the old ways, felt uneasy. The Pope, however, made it clear that transparency was not up for negotiation. He held a series of meetings with department heads, urging them to cooperate fully and reminding them that the Church's mission was to serve, not to protect privilege. The Pope also encouraged Vatican employees to come forward with concerns or suggestions, promising protection for whistleblowers and a fair process for addressing grievances. This open-door policy began to break down barriers of fear and silence that had long existed within the Vatican bureaucracy. Impact on the faithful. For ordinary Catholics, the new transparency was both reassuring and empowering. Parishioners around the world could now see how their offerings were being spent. Dioceses and religious orders were encouraged to adopt similar practices, creating a ripple effect of openness throughout the global Church. Charitable organizations working with the Vatican reported an increase in donations as people felt more confident that their gifts would be used responsibly. Laypeople, especially younger Catholics, voiced appreciation for a church that was willing to hold itself accountable. The broader message, Pope Leo XIV's financial transparency blitz, sent a clear message: the Church must not only preach honesty and justice but practice them at every level. By opening the Vatican's books to the world, the Pope demonstrated that true spiritual authority is rooted in trust, not secrecy. The reform also challenged other institutions, religious, governmental, and corporate, to examine their own practices. If the Vatican, with its centuries-old traditions and global reach, could embrace transparency, what excuse did others have looking forward? The financial transparency Blitz was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The Pope promised that future reports would be even more detailed and that the Oversight Committee would have the independence and resources needed to do its job. He also hinted at further reforms to come, including new guidelines for ethical investing and greater oversight of church properties and contracts. For Pope Leo XIV, transparency was not just a policy, it was a matter of faith. We are stewards, not owners, he reminded the Church. We must be worthy of the trust placed in us for the sake of the gospel and the good of all. With this bold reform, Pope Leo XIV continued to prove that his papacy would be defined by courage, humility, and a relentless pursuit of integrity, no matter the cost. Part 5. Zero Tolerance Policy for Abuse. If the world was already reeling from Pope Leo XIV's bold reforms in finance and social outreach, his next move would prove even more seismic, one that would address the deepest wounds within the Catholic Church and send a message of hope and accountability to survivors around the globe. In his fifth major reform, Pope Leo XIV announced a strict, uncompromising zero-tolerance policy for all cases of abuse within the Church, the historic declaration. The announcement came during a highly anticipated address to a global gathering of bishops, clergy, and lay leaders in the Vatican's Synod Hall. The Pope's words were direct and unequivocal. The Church must be a sanctuary for the vulnerable, not a hiding place for the guilty. From this day forward, any credible accusation of abuse, no matter the rank or role, will result in immediate suspension and independent investigation, and if proven, permanent removal from ministry. There will be no exceptions, no cover-ups, and no more silence. The declaration was met with a standing ovation from many in attendance, while others sat in stunned silence, realizing the magnitude of what had just been proclaimed. For decades, the Church had struggled with the legacy of abuse scandals, which had shattered lives, destroyed trust, and cast a long shadow over its moral authority. While previous popes had taken steps toward addressing the crisis, many survivors and advocates felt that the Church's response had been too slow, too secretive, and too lenient. Immediate actions. Pope Leo XIV wasted no time in turning words into action. He ordered the creation of an independent commission staffed by lay experts in law psychology and child protection to oversee all investigations of abuse allegations. This commission was granted full authority to access church records, interview witnesses, and make recommendations directly to the Pope without interference from local bishops or Vatican officials. In addition, the Pope mandated that all dioceses and religious orders worldwide adopt the same zero-tolerance standards. Training programs for clergy staff and volunteers were overhauled to emphasize prevention, detection, and immediate reporting of any suspected abuse. Whistleblower protections were strengthened and survivors were given priority access to counseling, support, and compensation. Transparency and accountability. One of the most groundbreaking aspects of the new policy was its commitment to transparency. For the first time, the Vatican began publishing regular public reports on abuse cases, including statistics on allegations, investigations, and outcomes. These reports were made available online, and the Pope invited independent journalists and watchdog organizations to review the data and hold the Church accountable. Pope Leo XIV also instituted a policy of public apology and restitution. In a televised address, he personally apologized to survivors and their families, acknowledging the Church's failures and pledging concrete steps toward healing and justice. To those who have suffered, I say your pain is real, your voice matters, and your healing is our sacred duty. The Church will no longer hide from its past. We will face it together with humility and resolve. Global impact. The zero-tolerance policy sent shockwaves through the Catholic world and beyond. Survivors groups and advocacy organizations welcomed the reforms as long overdue, while many faithful expressed relief that the Church was finally taking decisive action. Some bishops and clergy, especially those in regions where abuse had been covered up, expressed concern about the new level of scrutiny and accountability. However, Pope Leo XIV made it clear that the protection of the vulnerable would take precedence over institutional reputation. Governments and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries praised the Vatican's new approach, and offered to collaborate on investigations and prevention efforts. The United Nations and international human rights groups cited the policy as a model for other institutions grappling with abuse scandals. Cultural change. Within the Church, perhaps the most profound effect of the zero-tolerance policy was the cultural shift it sparked within the Church itself. For too long, a culture of secrecy, clericalism, and misplaced loyalty had allowed abuse to go unchecked. Pope Leo XIV's reforms challenged this culture head-on, insisting that the Church's first loyalty must always be to the vulnerable and the truth. Seminaries and Catholic universities began to incorporate new curricula focused on ethics boundaries and the power dynamics of ministry. Bishops and pastors were required to attend workshops on safeguarding and accountability. The message was clear: no one, regardless of rank, was above the law or the Gospel's call to protect the innocent. The voices of survivors. Central to the Pope's approach was the inclusion of survivors in the reform process. The independent commission included survivor advocates, and the Vatican established a permanent advisory council composed of survivors and their families. Their stories, insights, and recommendations shaped the Church's policies and practices. One survivor, speaking at a Vatican press conference, said, "For the first time, I feel truly heard. The Pope's actions give me hope that what happened to me will not happen to others." This is the beginning of real change. Ongoing challenges. While the zero-tolerance policy was widely praised, Pope Leo XIV acknowledged that much work remained. He called for ongoing vigilance, regular review of policies, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. He also urged other religious and secular institutions to adopt similar standards, emphasizing that the protection of children and vulnerable adults is a universal moral imperative. A turning point for the Church. With this reform, Pope Leo XIV marked a turning point in the Church's history. By confronting the darkest chapters of its past with honesty and resolve, the Church began to reclaim its moral authority and rebuild trust with the faithful and the world. The zero-tolerance policy became a model for other organizations, demonstrating that true leadership means putting the vulnerable first, no matter the cost. As the world watched, Pope Leo XIV's unwavering commitment to justice and healing set a new standard for the Church and inspired hope for a future where every person is safe, valued, and heard. Part 6. Laypeople in Vatican Leadership. In the first month of Pope Leo XIV's papacy, the world witnessed a series of reforms that challenged centuries of tradition and expectations. Yet perhaps none was more quietly revolutionary than his decision to open the highest ranks of Vatican leadership to laypeople, both men and women, for the first time in history. Breaking the clerical ceiling. For centuries, the Vatican's most influential positions, those with real decision-making power, had been the exclusive domain of ordained clergy, primarily cardinals and bishops. Even as lay Catholics played vital roles in parishes, schools, and Catholic charities, the upper echelons of church governance remained closed to them. This clerical ceiling was often justified by tradition and canon law, but it increasingly stood at odds with the Church's own teachings on the dignity and gifts of all the baptized. Pope Leo XIV, known for his pastoral sensitivity and pragmatic vision, recognized that the challenges facing the modern Church, financial, social, technological, and moral, required a broader range of expertise and experience than the clergy alone could provide. He also understood that the credibility of the Church in the eyes of the world depended in part on its willingness to embrace diversity and shared responsibility. The historic appointments. In a surprise announcement at a Vatican press briefing, the Pope revealed the appointment of several lay professionals to key positions within the Roman Curia, the Vatican's central administration. Among the new appointees were a female economist with decades of experience in international banking, named as Secretary of the Vatican's Economic Affairs Council, a lay theologian and educator chosen to oversee the Congregation for Catholic Education, a human rights lawyer appointed to a newly created office for the protection of minors and vulnerable adults, a communications expert tasked with modernizing the Vatican's media and digital outreach. The Pope emphasized that these appointments were not symbolic, but substantive. The gifts of the Holy Spirit are not limited by ordination. The Church needs the wisdom, experience, and faith of all her children. men and women, clergy and laity alike. Reactions. Inside and outside the Vatican, news of the appointment spread rapidly, generating both excitement and debate. Within the Vatican, many younger staff and reform-minded clergy welcomed the change, seeing it as a long overdue recognition of the talents and dedication of lay Catholics. Some older officials, however, expressed concerns about the erosion of clerical authority and the potential for conflicts with canon law. Outside the Vatican, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Catholic women's groups in particular hailed the appointments as a breakthrough for gender equality in the Church. Lay associations and Catholic professionals around the world expressed hope that this would open new pathways for collaboration and innovation. Secular media outlets covered the story widely, with headlines such as "Pope appoints women to top Vatican posts" and "Lay experts to help govern the Church." Editorials praised the Pope's willingness to challenge tradition in pursuit of greater effectiveness and credibility. Theological and canonical implications. The inclusion of lay people in Vatican leadership was not without theological and legal complexities. Canon law had long reserved certain offices for the ordained, especially those involving sacramental or doctrinal authority. Pope Leo XIV, however, worked closely with canon lawyers to ensure that the new appointments respected church law while expanding the scope of lay participation. In areas where sacramental authority was required, the Pope made clear that lay leaders would collaborate with clergy, ensuring that the Church's teachings and traditions were upheld. At the same time, he insisted that lay expertise was essential for the Church's mission in the modern world. "We are one body with many members, each has a role to play." A new culture of collaboration. The impact of these appointments was felt almost immediately. Lay leaders brought fresh perspectives and skills to Vatican offices that had sometimes been insulated from outside ideas. Meetings became more dynamic, with a greater emphasis on teamwork, accountability, and results. The presence of women in leadership roles also encouraged more open discussions about issues such as family life education and social justice. Pope Leo XIV encouraged this new culture of collaboration, holding regular joint meetings with clergy and lay leaders. He urged all Vatican staff to listen deeply, speak honestly, and work together for the good of the whole Church. Global ripple effect. The Pope's example inspired dioceses and Catholic institutions around the world to reconsider their own leadership structures. Bishops began to appoint lay people, including women, to key advisory and administrative roles. Catholic universities and charities expanded opportunities for lay leadership. In many places, the reform sparked renewed energy and creativity as new voices and perspectives were welcomed into decision-making. Lay Catholics, who had long felt marginalized or underutilized, found new hope and motivation. Young people especially saw the reform as a sign that the Church valued their gifts and was willing to trust them with real responsibility. Challenges and opportunities. Of course, the transition was not without challenges. Some clergy struggled to adjust to sharing authority with lay colleagues. There were debates about boundaries, responsibilities, and the need for ongoing formation and support. The Pope acknowledged these difficulties but insisted that they were worth facing for the sake of a more vibrant and effective Church. He also stressed that the reform was not about diminishing the priesthood, but about enriching the Church's mission. The priesthood is a precious gift, but it is not the only gift. The Spirit calls all of us to serve each in our own way. A vision for the future. By opening the doors of Vatican leadership to lay people, Pope Leo XV signaled a new era of shared responsibility and collaboration in the Church. He challenged Catholics everywhere to recognize the gifts of all the baptized and to build a Church that is truly inclusive, dynamic, and responsive to the needs of the world. As one newly appointed lay leader put it, "This is not just about new faces in old offices, it's about a new way of being Church together." With this reform, Pope Leo XIV continued to prove that his papacy would be defined by courage, humility, and a deep trust in the people of God. Part 7. Environmental Action. Vatican Goes Solar. As the first month of Pope Leo XIV's transformative papacy progressed, the world watched with growing anticipation for what would come next. The answer arrived in the form of a sweeping environmental initiative, one that would not only set a new standard for the Vatican, but also inspire faith communities and governments worldwide. Pope Leo XIV announced an ambitious plan Vatican City would become carbon neutral by 2030, beginning immediately with the installation of solar panels across its ancient rooftops and grounds. The announcement. The Pope unveiled his environmental vision during a special address in the Vatican Gardens, surrounded by schoolchildren, scientists and religious leaders from around the world. "Creation is a gift entrusted to our care," he declared. "As stewards, we are called to act with wisdom and urgency. The time for words has passed, now is the time for action." He outlined a comprehensive plan: the installation of solar panels on all Vatican buildings, including St. Peter's Basilica, the Apostolic Palace, and Vatican museums; the transition of Vatican vehicles and public transport to electric or hybrid models; the implementation of strict energy efficiency standards and waste reduction programs; the creation of educational initiatives for Vatican staff, clergy, and visitors on sustainability and ecological responsibility. Why this was revolutionary. While previous popes, especially Francis with his encyclical Laudato Si', had spoken passionately about the environment, no pontiff had ever committed the Vatican itself to such a bold, measurable transformation. The Vatican, though small in size, is a powerful symbol. Its actions send a message to 1.3 billion Catholics and countless observers worldwide. By making Vatican City a model of ecological conversion, Pope Leo XIV aimed to show that faith and science, tradition and innovation could work hand in hand for the good of the planet. The solar rollout. Within days, scaffolding appeared on Vatican rooftops as teams of engineers and technicians began installing state-of-the-art solar panels. The project included not only the iconic basilica, but also administrative offices, residences, and even the Vatican pharmacy and post office. The Pope personally visited the first completed installation, blessing the panels and meeting with workers. He emphasized that every step, no matter how small, was an act of hope for future generations. The Vatican's Energy Office reported that within the first year, solar power would provide up to 60% of the city-state's electricity needs, with the goal of reaching 100% renewable energy by 2030. Global impact and reactions. The announcement made headlines around the world. Environmental groups praised the Vatican's leadership, calling it a historic example of moral responsibility in action. Catholic organizations, schools and parishes began launching their own green initiatives inspired by the Pope's call. Governments and international agencies reached out to collaborate, offering technical expertise and seeking to learn from the Vatican's experience. The United Nations invited the Pope to address its annual climate summit, where he urged all nations to adopt ambitious, concrete goals for carbon neutrality. Education and spirituality. Pope Leo XV insisted that the environmental reform was not just technical, but spiritual. He called for an ecological conversion in the hearts of all believers, an attitude of gratitude, humility, and responsibility toward creation. New educational programs were launched for Vatican staff and clergy, focusing on sustainable living, ethical consumption, and the theology of creation. Pilgrims and tourists visiting the Vatican were invited to participate in workshops and guided tours, highlighting the city-state's green transformation. The Pope also encouraged dioceses and parishes worldwide to follow suit, offering grants and resources for local solar projects, tree planting and conservation efforts. Overcoming challenges. The transition was not without obstacles. Some traditionalists questioned the aesthetics of solar panels on historic buildings, while others worried about the costs and logistics. The Pope addressed these concerns directly. Our love for beauty must never become an excuse for inaction. The greatest beauty is a world where all life can flourish. Financially, the Vatican partnered with ethical investment funds and received donations from Catholic philanthropists and environmental foundations. The Pope insisted on full transparency in all contracts and spending, building on his earlier financial reforms. A model for the world. As the solar panels gleamed atop the Vatican's ancient stones, they became a powerful symbol of hope and renewal. The world's media broadcast images of the transformation, sparking conversations in homes, schools and parliaments about what could be possible elsewhere. Pope Leo XIV's environmental initiative inspired faith communities of all traditions to examine their own ecological footprints and to take bold steps toward sustainability. Interfaith dialogues on climate action gained new momentum, with the Vatican hosting international conferences on faith and the environment, legacy and vision. For Pope Leo XIV, the move toward carbon neutrality was about more than energy policy. It was a testament to the Church's commitment to the common good and to future generations. In his closing words at the Vatican Gardens, he declared, "Let our rooftops shine with the light of hope. Let our actions speak louder than our prayers. In caring for our common home, we honor the Creator and love our neighbor." This reform marked another milestone in a papacy defined by courage, vision, and a willingness to lead by example. As the sun set over the solar-powered Vatican, the world looked on not just in admiration, but in inspiration, ready to follow the path Pope Leo XV had blazed. Part 8. Global Listening Synod, a church that hears every voice. As the first month of Pope Leo XIV's papacy drew to a close, the Vatican was abuzz with conversations, hope, and even controversy. Yet the Pope's next reform would prove to be one of his most ambitious and transformative, the launch of a global listening synod, an unprecedented worldwide consultation that invited every Catholic, regardless of background or circumstance, to share their voice with the Church. The announcement Pope Leo XIV made the announcement in a live-streamed address, broadcast in dozens of languages and watched by millions. Standing before a mosaic of faces, young and old, lay and clergy from every continent, he declared, "The Church is not a fortress but a family. Every voice matters, every story is sacred. Today we open our hearts and our ears to the whole people of God." He explained that the Global Listening Synod would be the most inclusive consultation in church history. For the first time, Catholics everywhere, women and men, youth and elders, the poor and the wealthy, the devout and the questioning, those at the center and those at the margins, were invited to participate directly in shaping the Church's future. How it worked. The Synod was designed as a multi-phase process combining local gatherings, parish discussions, and most revolutionary of all, a digital platform open to all. The platform, accessible from smartphones and computers, allowed participants to share their experiences, hopes, concerns, and ideas in their own language and context. Special outreach was made to groups often left unheard, survivors of abuse and those who had left the Church in pain or anger, women including those in religious life, and those who felt excluded from decision-making, young people, migrants, refugees, LGBTQ+, Catholics and the disabled, indigenous communities and those living in regions of conflict or poverty. The Vatican partnered with Catholic universities, social media platforms and local dioceses to ensure accessibility and security. The process was transparent with regular updates and summaries published online. Why this was revolutionary. Synods, gatherings of bishops to discuss church matters, were nothing new, but they had historically been top-down, limited to clergy and select experts. Pope Leo XIV's vision turned that model on its head, making the Synod a truly bottom-up grassroots process. He insisted that the Church could not discern God's will for the future without listening to the lived reality of all its members. The Holy Spirit speaks not only through the hierarchy, but through the whole people of God, he said. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, millions of Catholics logged on to the digital platform or attended local listening sessions. Stories poured in from every corner of the globe. A young woman in Manila sharing her dreams for women's leadership, an elderly farmer in Kenya describing the challenges of faith during drought, a refugee family in Lebanon expressing gratitude for the Church's support, a survivor of abuse in Ireland offering painful but hopeful testimony. Parishes and dioceses reported a surge in engagement, with many people participating in church life for the first time in years. Catholic media covered the process daily, highlighting diverse voices and emerging themes, challenges and opportunities. The scale of the synod presented logistical and pastoral challenges. Moderators were trained to handle sensitive topics with compassion and confidentiality. The Vatican invested in translation and data analysis to ensure that every voice could be heard and summarized faithfully. There were debates about controversial issues such as women's roles, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and church governance. Pope Leo XIV encouraged open, respectful dialogue, reminding participants that unity is not uniformity, and listening does not mean immediate agreement. Some critics worried that the process would raise false hopes or create division. The Pope responded by emphasizing that the Synod was not about quick fixes, but about building a culture of encounter, humility, and discernment. Impact on the Church. The Global Listening Synod began to reshape the Church's self-understanding. Bishops and Vatican officials were required to read and reflect on the testimonies. Local leaders were encouraged to respond concretely to the needs and insights raised by their communities. The Synod also inspired similar processes in other Christian denominations and faith traditions, sparking a global movement for listening and inclusion. A church that walks together, Pope Leo XIV described the Synod as a journey, a pilgrimage of listening, learning, and conversion. He urged the Church to walk together, especially with those who felt forgotten or excluded. We are called to be a church with open doors and open hearts, a church that listens before it speaks and loves before it judges. The Pope's vision was clear: a more synodal church where authority is exercised as service and where every member is valued and heard. Looking ahead, the first phase of the Synod concluded with a massive online gathering where highlights from every continent were shared and celebrated. The Pope promised that the insights gathered would shape future policies, reforms, and pastoral priorities. As the world watched, Pope Leo XIV's Global Listening Synod set a new standard for participation, transparency, and humility in church leadership. It showed that the Church could be both ancient and new, rooted in tradition, yet open to the Spirit speaking through the people. With this reform, Pope Leo XIV continued to prove that his papacy was not just about changing structures, but about changing hearts, beginning with the simple, radical act of listening. Part 9, Reform of Papal Protocol, a humble pontiff for a new era. As the world continued to marvel at the sweeping changes initiated by Pope Leo XIV, another reform quietly but powerfully began to reshape the very image of the papacy, the reform of papal protocol. In a move that blended humility with accessibility, Pope Leo XIV set out to simplify the traditional attire and ceremonies of the papal office, reducing excessive pomp and focusing instead on direct personal interactions with the faithful. The announcement, the reform, was first signaled in a letter addressed to all Vatican officials and published on the Holy See's website. Pope Leo XIV wrote, "The power of the gospel is not found in gold or silk, but in service and compassion. Let us remove every barrier, material or ceremonial, that stands between the shepherd and the flock." He explained that while tradition and beauty have their place in the Church, the heart of Christian leadership is found in humility, simplicity, and presence. The Pope's message was clear: the time had come for the papacy to set aside unnecessary grandeur and become more approachable and relatable to ordinary people. Simplifying papal attire. The first visible change was the Pope's own wardrobe. Pope Leo XIV began appearing in public wearing a simple white cassock, often without the traditional red shoes, gold-embroidered stoles, or elaborate mitres. On many occasions, he chose to forego the mozzetta, the short cape worn by popes, and the ornate papal ring, opting instead for a plain silver cross. During major liturgical celebrations, the Pope encouraged cardinals and bishops to do the same, adopting simpler vestments and focusing on the spiritual meaning of the rites rather than the spectacle. The Vatican's Master of Ceremonies announced that future papal events would emphasize prayer participation and community over pageantry. Redefining ceremonies. Pope Leo XIV also reimagined the structure of papal ceremonies. He shortened lengthy processions, reduced the number of honorary guards and attendants, and eliminated certain archaic rituals that had little relevance to contemporary faith. Instead of grand entrances, the Pope often arrived early to greet the faithful, shaking hands, blessing children, and listening to personal stories. One of the most striking changes came during the annual Holy Week celebrations. Rather than presiding from a distant throne, Pope Leo XIV chose to celebrate Mass among the people, sometimes even stepping down from the altar to wash the feet of parishioners from all walks of life, migrants, prisoners, the disabled, and the elderly. Direct encounters with the faithful. Perhaps the most beloved aspect of the reform was the Pope's insistence on personal encounters. He made unannounced visits to hospitals, schools, and prisons, often traveling with minimal security and no entourage. He dined with the poor, visited families in their homes, and spent time with young people in informal gatherings. The Pope also launched a monthly Open Doors Day at the Vatican, inviting ordinary Catholics and pilgrims to meet with him in small groups for conversation, prayer, and mutual encouragement. These encounters were not scripted or staged. Participants were encouraged to speak freely and share their hopes and struggles, impact on the Vatican and beyond. The impact of these changes was felt immediately within the Vatican. Staff and clergy reported a renewed sense of purpose and unity, inspired by the Pope's example of servant leadership. Many bishops and priests around the world followed suit, simplifying their own ceremonies and making themselves more available to their communities. The faithful responded with enthusiasm and gratitude. Letters and messages poured into the Vatican thanking Pope Leo XIV for his humility and closeness to the people. Social media was filled with photos and stories of personal encounters with the Pope, many describing how a simple gesture or kind word had renewed their faith. Reactions and reflections. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some traditionalists worried that the loss of ceremony would erode the dignity and mystique of the papacy. Others feared that too much informality might undermine respect for the office or the sacredness of liturgical rites. Pope Leo XIV addressed these concerns, directly affirming that simplicity does not mean a lack of reverence. The true dignity of the Church, he said, is found in the love we show, not in the robes we wear or the thrones we occupy. He also emphasized that the reform was not about rejecting tradition, but about returning to the heart of the gospel. Jesus walked among the people, touched the sick, and listened to the suffering. We must do the same. A new model of leadership. The reform of papal protocol marked a profound shift in the Church's approach to leadership. By breaking down barriers, both literal and symbolic, Pope Leo XIV invited the world to see the papacy not as a distant monarchy, but as a ministry of presence and compassion. This new model of leadership resonated far beyond the Vatican. Other Christian leaders and faith traditions took note, with some adopting similar practices of simplicity and accessibility. The reform also inspired secular leaders to rethink the role of ceremony and status in public service. The lasting legacy. As the first year of Pope Leo XIV's papacy unfolded, the image of a humble, approachable pontiff became one of its defining features. For many Catholics, especially those who had felt alienated or intimidated by the Church's grandeur, the changes were a welcome invitation to return and reconnect. In the words of one parishioner who met the Pope during an Open Doors Day, "For the first time I felt like the Pope was not just a figure on a balcony, but a shepherd who knows his sheep." With this reform, Pope Leo XIV continued to fulfill his vision of a church that is open, humble, and close to the people, a church where every person is seen, heard, and loved. Part 10. A personal apology for church failures, a call for healing. As the first month of Pope Leo XIV's papacy drew to a close, he prepared to deliver perhaps his most courageous and emotionally charged reform yet. In a globally televised address, broadcast live from St. Peter's Basilica and translated into dozens of languages, Pope Leo XIV did what few leaders in history have dared. He offered a direct, heartfelt apology for the Church's historical failings, including abuse, discrimination, and silence in the face of injustice. The apology. Standing before a simple altar, without the usual trappings of papal ceremony, the Pope spoke from the heart. "Brothers and sisters, I stand before you not as a perfect man, but as a servant who has heard your pain. I ask forgiveness for every time the Church has failed to protect the innocent, for every voice silenced by fear, for every wound left unhealed by our neglect. We cannot change the past, but we can change our hearts, our actions, and our future together. He named the specific wounds that have haunted the Church, the suffering of abuse survivors and their families, the marginalization of women minorities and those whose voices were ignored, the times when the Church remained silent in the face of injustice or failed to defend the vulnerable. Concrete steps for restitution. But Pope Leo XIV's apology was not just words. He outlined a series of concrete actions to accompany the Church's repentance restitution funds. The Vatican would establish dedicated funds to support survivors of abuse, and those harmed by Church failures managed transparently with the input of independent experts and survivor advocates. Public memorials and days of remembrance. The Church would create spaces and annual observances to honor the memory of victims and to educate future generations. Ongoing reform. The Pope pledged to continue reviewing Church policies and structures, inviting outside oversight and lay participation to ensure lasting change. Global prayer and healing initiatives. Parishes and dioceses worldwide would be encouraged to hold services of reconciliation listening sessions and opportunities for communal healing. The world responds. The Pope's apology and concrete steps for restitution drew an outpouring of emotion and commentary from around the globe. Survivors and advocacy groups expressed gratitude, many saying they felt truly seen and heard by the Church for the first time. Faithful Catholics, as well as many outside the Church, praised the Pope's humility and courage. Some critics wondered if words could ever be enough, or if true healing was possible. Pope Leo XIV acknowledged these doubts, stating, "Trust is not rebuilt overnight. It is earned step by step through honesty, justice, and love. We must walk this road together." A turning point. The apology marked a turning point not just for the Vatican, but for the global Catholic community. It set a new moral standard for leadership, one that faces the truth, takes responsibility, and acts with compassion. Pope Leo XIV's message was clear: the Church's future depends on its willingness to learn from its past, to listen to those who have suffered, and to become a true beacon of hope and healing. Conclusion: a Church renewed, a world inspired. In just 1 month, Pope Leo XIV had shaken the foundations of the Vatican and inspired millions around the world. His 10 reforms, restoring dignity to workers, opening the Vatican's doors to the poor, walking barefoot in solidarity, embracing transparency, enforcing zero tolerance for abuse, empowering lay leadership, championing environmental action, listening to every voice, simplifying protocol, and offering a public apology, have begun to transform the Church from within. But perhaps the greatest legacy of this first month is the spirit of humility, courage, and hope that now animates the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIV has shown that true leadership is not about power or perfection, but about service, honesty, and the relentless pursuit of justice and mercy. The world is watching. The journey is just beginning. If these changes moved you, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Which reform do you believe will have the most lasting impact? Join the conversation, because renewal begins with all of us.